Daniel was not the kind of man who complained about life, but anyone who saw him could tell it hadn't been easy. He was a single father, raising his little girl all on his own. Every morning, before the sun rose, he would quietly move around their small apartment, trying not to wake her up while he got ready for work. His days were long, sometimes exhausting, but he always made sure he had time for her. His daughter, Lily, was just 7 years old, but she was already the light of his world. With her wide smile and curious eyes, she had a way of making even the hardest days feel worth it. Still, Daniel carried a weight in his heart. Losing his wife a few years ago had changed everything. The silence in the house was heavy at times, and though he did his best to hide it, Lily could sense when he was tired or when his mind was somewhere else. Daniel worked at a company that designed new technology. His job was stable, and he was grateful for it, but it was also demanding. Some days, he stayed at the office late into the night. Other times, he brought work home, spreading out papers and sketches across the kitchen table, while Lily sat nearby doing her homework or drawing pictures. The other fathers he knew had partners at home to share the burden, but Daniel had no one else. He was mother and father both. He cooked, he cleaned, he tucked Lily into bed at night, and he also tried to climb the endless ladder at work, hoping for a promotion that would make life easier for them. Sometimes he wondered if he was doing enough, if he was being both strong and soft in all the ways Lily needed him to be. Yet, despite all the struggles, there was one thing Daniel knew for sure. Lily was growing up with love. And maybe love, more than anything else, was the secret to raising a child. On most evenings after dinner, Lily would curl up beside him while he worked. She would lean her head on his shoulder and ask little questions. "Daddy, why are there so many lines on this paper? Or what does this circle mean?" Daniel would smile and try to explain in simple words, though most of the time, she just nodded and giggled, more interested in spending time with him than understanding the designs. But what amazed him was how observant she was. Even at such a young age, Lily noticed things most people didn't. She could sense when he was worried, and she often tried to cheer him up in her own small ways. If Daniel was quiet, she would bring him a drawing she made at school, or she would tell him a silly joke she had heard from her friends. Her innocence was like a shield against his stress. Still, there were moments when Daniel felt stretched thin. He wished he had more energy, more time, more patience. Some nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Lily would grow up missing something because her mother wasn't there. He promised himself that he would do everything he could to make sure she never felt alone, even if that meant pushing himself harder at work and at home. Life in their little apartment wasn't fancy, but it was full of warmth. Their fridge was decorated with Lily's colorful drawings. The couch had a blanket they always shared while watching cartoons, and the bookshelf in the corner held both his work manuals and her storybooks. It was a small world, but it was theirs. Every morning before school, Lily would look up at him with sleepy eyes and say, "Daddy, don't forget to smile today." He laughed every time she said it, but deep down, those words kept him going. She didn't know how much strength she gave him just by being herself. Daniel often thought back to the day he had promised his wife, lying in the hospital bed, that he would raise their daughter with all the love in his heart. It was a promise he held onto every single day. No matter how tired, no matter how stressed, Lily's happiness came first. What he didn't know was that his little girl was about to show him something that would change everything, not just at home, but even at his workplace, where some of the brightest minds were struggling. She was going to remind him, and everyone else, that sometimes the simplest solutions come from the purest hearts. But before that moment arrived, their lives carried on in their usual rhythm. Mornings were a rush of packing lunches, tying shoelaces, and walking hand in hand to school. Afternoons were filled with homework, laughter, and the occasional tantrum when Lily didn't want to eat her vegetables. Evenings ended with bedtime stories, Daniel's tired voice reading until Lily's eyes finally closed. Through it all, Daniel never stopped worrying about the future. He wanted to give his daughter the best, but with bills to pay and deadlines to meet, the road often felt uphill. Yet, in the quiet of their little home, surrounded by the love between father and daughter, there was always a sense of hope. It was in these small, ordinary moments that their extraordinary story was quietly building. Daniel's work was not the kind of job you could leave behind at the office. Even when he came home, parts of it followed him. Papers stuffed into his worn leather bag, sketches rolled up under his arm, and that constant look in his eyes like his mind was still running even after the day had ended. He worked at a technology company, not one of those shiny Silicon Valley giants people read about, but a steady firm that specialized in building systems for bigger businesses. Inside that company, Daniel was respected for his persistence, though he wasn't at the top. He wasn't a CEO or a senior engineer, just one of the many who helped keep the wheels turning. But lately, things had been more tense than usual. The company had been working on a huge project, something that could bring in a major client. It was a kind of deal that would make or break reputations. For weeks, the CEO and the senior engineers had been stuck on one piece of it, a critical problem that no one could seem to solve. Every time Daniel passed their conference room, he could see them gathered around a whiteboard, markers in hand, voices raised in frustration. He didn't need anyone to explain how serious it was. Even at his level, he felt the ripple of stress. Deadlines had been pushed, late nights were becoming normal, and even small tasks carried extra weight because everyone knew the future of the project hung in the balance. Daniel did his best to keep his head down and do his part, but he couldn't escape the tension. It followed him home at night. The dining table that should have been a place for family dinners was often covered in sheets of paper with diagrams and half-formed ideas. Sometimes he stared at them long after Lily had gone to bed, rubbing his tired eyes and wondering if there was some angle no one had considered. One Friday evening, he came home especially late. The office had been buzzing all day, the CEO pacing like a storm cloud while the engineers argued over possibilities. Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of it too. He didn't want to let anyone down. He didn't want to risk the stability of his job, not when Lily depended on him for everything. As he set his bag on the table and loosened his tie, Lily peeked out from her room, still awake even though it was past her bedtime. She had her little blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair messy from lying down. "You look tired, Daddy," she said softly. Daniel forced a smile and knelt to hug her. "It's just work, sweetheart. Go back to bed, okay?" But Lily shook her head and followed him into the kitchen, where he pulled out the stack of papers he had been carrying. She sat at the table across from him, watching as he spread them out. "What is it?" she asked. He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's complicated. Something for work. You wouldn't understand." But Lily didn't move. She propped her chin on her hands and studied the messy lines and circles on the page, as if they were a puzzle. Daniel noticed her curiosity, but didn't think much of it. To him, these were problems that even the smartest adults couldn't solve. The truth was, the pressure was beginning to wear him down. He knew the senior engineers were some of the best in the business, yet they were running in circles. If they couldn't find the answer, how could anyone else? Still, Daniel couldn't stop himself from trying. At night, when the world was quiet, he traced the same lines with his pen, hoping some new thought would break through. On this particular night, Lily stayed beside him longer than usual. She didn't say much, but her presence was comforting. Daniel glanced at her every now and then, thinking how different her world was from his. She was still small, innocent, untouched by the stress of deadlines and bills. And maybe that's why she looked at the papers differently, without the same blinders the adults wore. Finally, after a long silence, Lily spoke. "Why does it have to be like that?" Daniel looked up, surprised. "Like what?" She pointed at one of the pages. "Why does that line have to go there? Couldn't it just go this way instead?" He stared at where her finger rested, a little smudge of crayon still on her nail from whatever she had been coloring earlier. For a moment, he almost laughed, but then he paused. It was such an innocent suggestion, almost childlike in its simplicity. But it was also something he realized he hadn't considered. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "this is really complicated." Lily grinned and shrugged. "I think it looks easy peasy." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head, but her words lingered in his mind even after he sent her back to bed. Easy peasy. He looked again at the spot she had pointed to, tracing it with his pen. It seemed too simple, too obvious. Yet the more he thought about it, the more it made a strange kind of sense. That night, Daniel didn't sleep much. He sat at the table long after midnight, going over the idea again and again. He didn't know if it could work, but he couldn't deny the spark it had lit in him. It was as if Lily's innocent eyes had cut through all the noise that had been clouding their judgment at work. By the time the morning sun came through the blinds, Daniel was both nervous and curious. He knew he had to bring it up at the office, but how could he explain that the suggestion had come from his 7-year-old daughter? Would they laugh at him? Would they dismiss it without a second thought? Still, he decided he would try. After all, what did he have to lose? What he didn't know was that this simple moment at the kitchen table, with his daughter pointing out something she thought was obvious, would soon change everything. The experts at his company, the people who had been working day and night on this very problem, were about to hear a solution that none of them had seen. And it would leave them completely speechless. Saturday mornings were usually quiet in their little apartment. Daniel liked to let Lily sleep in, knowing how much energy she burned during the week with school, friends, and play. But that morning, he was up early, the papers still scattered across the dining table, his mind turning over the same thought again and again. He kept seeing her little finger pointing at the diagram, her innocent voice saying, "Why not this way?" It had been such a small comment, so casual, but it refused to leave his head. He had spent half the night redrawing and testing ideas in his notebook, and every time he came back to it, the simplicity of her suggestion felt more and more powerful. By the time Lily stumbled out of her room, her hair messy and her pajamas wrinkled, Daniel had already filled 3 more pages with sketches. She rubbed her eyes and yawned. "Daddy, are you still working?" she asked, her voice soft with sleep. Daniel smiled. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Want some breakfast?" She nodded, climbing into her usual chair at the table. As he poured milk over her cereal, he couldn't help but glance at the spot where she had pointed last night. He wanted to ask her more, but she was just a little girl, focused on spooning cereal into her mouth and swinging her legs under the chair. "Do you remember what you said last night?" he asked. Lily grinned. "You mean about the line?" He chuckled. "Yes, about the line." She shrugged. It just looked funny, like it was going the long way around. "If you can go straight, why not just go straight? Easy peasy." Daniel stopped for a moment, staring at her as she went back to eating. To her, it was nothing more than common sense. To him, it was something that highly trained engineers had failed to see for weeks. That evening, after Lily went to play in her room, Daniel sat down again with his papers. He redrew the entire layout from scratch, this time starting with Lily's easy-peasy idea. And the more he worked through it, the more everything seemed to click into place. What had felt like an impossible puzzle suddenly opened up. The knots began to untangle. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the finished sketch in disbelief. Could it really be this simple? He whispered to himself. The thought made him both excited and nervous. If it worked, it could save the project. But how would he explain to his colleagues that his 7-year-old daughter had seen the solution first? Later that night, Lily came out of her room carrying a drawing she had made with crayons. "Look, Daddy," she said proudly, holding up a colorful picture of their apartment building with the 2 of them standing in front. She had drawn herself with a bright pink dress and Daniel with a big smile. Above them, she had scribbled a rainbow that stretched across the sky. He smiled as he took the paper from her. "It's beautiful, Lily. You're an artist." She leaned against him. "And you're smart. You're going to solve your work problem, Daddy. I know you will." Those words sank deep into his heart. She believed in him with no hesitation, no doubt. And maybe that was why she could see things so clearly, because she didn't carry the same fear of failure that adults did. The next day was Sunday, and Daniel tried to focus on family time. They went to the park, shared ice cream, and laughed as Lily chased pigeons across the grass. But even as he pushed her on the swings, his mind kept drifting back to the sketch on the table at home. By the time Monday morning arrived, Daniel felt a mixture of nerves and determination. He carried the papers into the office, rehearsing in his mind how he might bring it up. His colleagues were already gathering in the conference room, coffee cups in hand, their faces tight with frustration. The CEO stood at the front, arms crossed, staring at the whiteboard filled with failed attempts. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice heavy. "If we can't solve this, we'll lose the client. And if we lose the client, we all know what that means." The room went quiet. No one wanted to imagine what that meant. Daniel hesitated, clutching the papers in his hands. His heart pounded as he thought of Lily's little voice saying, "Easy peasy." Maybe, just maybe, she had been right all along. He raised his hand slowly. I might have an idea." Dozens of eyes turned to him. He wasn't one of the top engineers, not someone who usually spoke up in moments like this. The CEO raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Daniel swallowed hard and stepped forward, placing his sketch on the table. "I was looking at this section differently. What if instead of taking the long route, we connected directly here?" He pointed to the exact spot Lily had shown him. For a moment, silence filled the room. The senior engineers leaned in, studying the diagram. One of them frowned, shaking his head. "It's too simple." Another one, however, tilted his head thoughtfully. "Wait, if we test this path, it might actually work." The CEO leaned closer, eyes narrowing as he examined the drawing. He didn't say anything right away, but Daniel could feel the tension in the room shifting. It was the first time anyone had considered something so straightforward. And although Daniel didn't dare say it aloud, he knew where the idea had come from. Not from long hours of study, not from advanced equations, but from the innocent wisdom of a little girl who believed that if something could be easy, then maybe it should be. Daniel stood there quietly, heart racing, as the experts debated. He didn't know yet how it would turn out, but he knew one thing for certain. Lily had seen something they had all missed, and soon the entire team was about to realize it too. The conference room was thick with tension. Papers covered the table. The whiteboard was crammed with failed ideas, and the sound of pens tapping nervously filled the silence. Daniel stood there, his sketch in front of the CEO, waiting for a reaction. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. Most of the time, he kept his head down and just did his job. But now, every eye in the room was on him. One of the senior engineers broke the silence first. "It looks too simple. There's no way it could be that easy." Another leaned in closer, running a hand through his hair. "But think about it. We've been overcomplicating this for weeks. What if we've been making it harder than it has to be?" The CEO tapped his fingers against the table, staring at the sketch. His sharp eyes scanned the lines, tracing the new connection Daniel had drawn. Finally, he looked up. "Test it." The room stirred. A few of the engineers grabbed their laptops, typing rapidly, running simulations. Others huddled around the whiteboard, erasing old scribbles and redrawing based on Daniel's sketch. Daniel stayed back, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes passed like hours. The team worked furiously, adjusting numbers, checking outcomes. At first, there were murmurs of doubt, but slowly, the tone began to shift. Heads that had been shaking in frustration now nodded. Frowns began to soften into looks of surprise. Finally, one of the senior engineers looked up from his screen. "It works." The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't doubt. It was disbelief. Another engineer double-checked the results. "He's right. It actually works." This solved the problem. Daniel felt his breath catch. He had expected them to dismiss the idea completely, to laugh it off as too naive. But now, the same people who had been stuck for weeks were staring at his simple sketch with astonishment. The CEO leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "Unbelievable," he said quietly. "All this time, and the answer was right there. Something so simple." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the room erupted. Voices overlapping, some laughing in amazement, others shaking their heads at how blind they had been. One engineer muttered, "How did we miss this?" It was staring us in the face. Daniel stood there, stunned. He couldn't help but hear Lily's little voice in his head, "Easy peasy." Of course, he didn't tell them that it had been his daughter's idea. How could he? They wouldn't believe him, or maybe they would, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had seen what none of them had. And now, these top experts, people with years of experience, were speechless over a solution so pure and straightforward that it had taken a child's eyes to notice. The CEO looked at Daniel, his expression thoughtful. "Good work," he said. "Sometimes the best ideas are the simplest ones." "I'm glad you spoke up." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to say thank you, but the words caught in his chest. All he could think about was Lily, sitting at the kitchen table with her cereal, pointing at the page like it was nothing. As the meeting wrapped up, the mood in the room had completely shifted. The tension was gone, replaced by energy and relief. People were smiling, clapping each other on the back, already planning how to move forward now that the problem was solved. Daniel quietly gathered his things, still processing what had just happened. He wasn't used to being noticed, but that morning, he had been the one to turn the tide. And it wasn't because he was smarter than the rest. It was because he had listened to the voice of a child who saw the world differently. When he walked out of the building that evening, the sun was already low, painting the sky orange and gold. For the first time in weeks, he felt light. The burden that had been pressing on his shoulders had lifted. At home, Lily was waiting by the window, her face lighting up when she saw him walking up the street. She ran to the door as he stepped inside, her little arms wrapping around his waist. "You look happy, Daddy," she said with a grin. Daniel knelt down, hugging her tightly. "I am, sweetheart. You helped me today." She tilted her head. "I did." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Remember what you said about going straight instead of a long way? That idea solved a big problem at my work." Her eyes widened. "Really?" "My idea." "Really?" he said softly. Everyone was amazed. They couldn't believe it. Lily giggled, covering her mouth with her hands. "And I just said easy peasy." Daniel laughed, the sound echoing through their small apartment. "Yes, you did. And sometimes, sweetheart, easy peasy is exactly what people need." That night, as he tucked her into bed, Daniel felt a swell of pride he had never experienced before. It wasn't pride for himself, but for his daughter, for her sharp little mind, her unshakable innocence, and the way she saw the world with fresh eyes. She didn't know it, but she had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that solutions don't always have to be complicated. That sometimes wisdom comes from places we least expect. As Lily drifted off to sleep, clutching her stuffed toy, Daniel whispered softly, "You're my miracle, Lily." In the quiet of the room, he realized that she hadn't just solved a problem at his job. She had reminded him that he was not alone in this journey. Even as a single dad, even with all the struggles and long nights, he had a partner in his daughter, a little girl with a big heart and a way of seeing things that could change everything. And though the CEO and the top engineers might never know the truth, Daniel knew. The credit belonged to Lily. She had left them all speechless without even trying. The following day at work felt different. For weeks, the office had been weighed down by the heavy silence of frustration, the kind that made every hallway feel longer, every conversation shorter. But now, there was a buzz in the air. People smiled as they passed each other, voices carried with energy instead of weariness. The impossible problem was finally solved, and everyone knew it. Daniel walked into the office quietly, as he always did, but this time, heads turned toward him. A few of his colleagues gave him nods of respect. Others patted him lightly on the shoulder as they passed. It was strange. He wasn't used to being noticed. Normally, he blended into the background, just another hardworking employee. But now, after yesterday's meeting, he was suddenly in the spotlight. When he reached his desk, one of the engineers approached him, a man who had barely spoken to him before. "Hey," he said, almost awkwardly. "That was sharp thinking yesterday. I'll be honest, I didn't see it coming. None of us did." Daniel smiled politely, his voice quiet. "Thanks." But in his heart, he knew the truth. It hadn't been his thinking at all. It had been Lily's. The idea that now had everyone talking was born at his own dining table, spoken with a child's innocence and confidence. Later that morning, the CEO called another meeting. Everyone filed into the conference room, though this time the mood was light, even hopeful. On the screen, at the front of the room, data and simulations confirmed it. The simple new approach was holding up. Not only did it work, but it also made the system more efficient than anyone had predicted. The CEO stood at the front, his voice carrying across the room. I want everyone to pay attention to what happened here. We spent weeks chasing complicated solutions, thinking we needed something big, something clever. But in the end, it was a simple idea that saved us. And that should be a reminder to all of us. Sometimes, the answer is not in making things harder, but in making them clearer. He paused, glancing toward Daniel. And I want to thank Daniel for bringing this forward. It took courage to speak up when the room was full of senior voices. That kind of courage matters. There was a round of applause. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to the attention. He nodded in acknowledgement, but in his mind he pictured Lily's little grin, her voice saying, "Easy peasy." If only they knew who the real genius was. As the meeting ended, a few engineers lingered behind, still shaking their heads in disbelief. One of them muttered, half to himself, "I can't believe it." Weeks of work, sleepless nights, and the answer was this obvious. Another laughed, though it wasn't unkind. We were too busy trying to be clever to notice what was right in front of us. Daniel listened quietly, but inside, he was filled with warmth. He wished Lily could have seen their faces in that moment, the astonishment, the humility, the way even the most experienced professionals had been humbled by a simple line on a page. That evening, when he got home, Lily was waiting for him in her usual spot by the window. She came running as soon as he opened the door. "Daddy, did they like your idea?" she asked eagerly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Daniel knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "They loved it," he said softly. "They couldn't believe it worked." Her little face lit up. "See? I told you. Easy peasy." He laughed, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, sweetheart. You did." They sat down together for dinner, and as she chattered about her day at school, Daniel found himself thinking about how much she had changed his world. She wasn't just his daughter. She was his partner in ways she didn't even realize. She gave him strength when he felt weak, clarity when he was lost, and now even solutions when he least expected them. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, Daniel stood by her doorway, watching her breathe softly in the glow of her nightlight. He thought about the meeting earlier, about the applause, about the CEO's words. And then he thought about how none of it would have happened without her. He whispered quietly into the stillness, "You left them all speechless, Lily. You don't even know it, but you did." At the office the next day, things moved quickly. With the problem solved, the project moved forward smoothly. The client, who had been growing impatient, was impressed by the sudden breakthrough. Praise came down from every level, and the CEO, normally reserved, seemed almost proud as he spoke about the team's success. But among the engineers, there was a quiet lesson being shared. Over cups of coffee and whispered conversations, they admitted how they had overlooked the simple answer. "We should remember this," one of them said. "Not every solution has to be complicated. Sometimes we need to think more like kids." Daniel heard those words and smiled to himself. If only they knew just how true that was. For Lily, it was just a casual observation at the kitchen table. For Daniel's colleagues, it was a breakthrough. For Daniel himself, it was something even bigger. It was proof that his daughter was extraordinary, that her way of seeing the world could teach even the brightest minds something new. The week after the breakthrough felt like a blur. The project that had once felt doomed now moved forward faster than anyone expected. Meetings were filled with energy. Emails carried a tone of relief. And the CEO, normally stern and distant, actually cracked a smile in the hallway. People were calling it a turning point, a stroke of luck, or even a miracle. For Daniel, though, it was something far more personal. Every time he heard someone praising the solution, every time a colleague patted him on the back, his mind drifted back to the little girl sitting at their dining table, spooning cereal and saying with all the innocence in the world, "Easy peasy." He never corrected anyone who gave him credit. It didn't matter. In his heart, he knew the truth. And in the quiet of his home, he celebrated not his own success, but Lily's brilliance. One evening, after a long but lighter day at work, Daniel came home to find Lily sprawled on the floor with crayons, surrounded by sheets of paper filled with rainbows, stick figures, and castles. She looked up at him with her usual bright smile. "Daddy, you're home," she exclaimed, jumping to her feet and running into his arms. Daniel hugged her tightly, closing his eyes for a moment as he held her. No matter what happened at work, no matter what recognition came his way, this, coming home to her, was what mattered most. "Guess what?" he said, kneeling down to her level. "Everyone at work is so happy now. The big problem is gone. We're moving forward again." Her eyes widened. "Because of my idea?" Daniel chuckled. "Yes, sweetheart. Because of your idea." Lily giggled, covering her mouth with her little hands. "And they didn't know it was me?" He shook his head. "No. Only you and I know." She looked thoughtful for a moment, then shrugged. "That's okay, as long as you're happy." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. How could a child so young be so wise? He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her gently. "I'm more than happy. I'm proud. So proud." Later that night, as he tucked her into bed, Lily asked a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, do you think I'm smart?" He sat on the edge of her bed, smiling softly. "Smart? Lily, you're more than smart. You see things that others can't. You notice what people overlook. That's a gift." She hugged her stuffed toy tightly. "But I just said easy peasy." Daniel laughed quietly. "And that's the beauty of it. Sometimes the smartest things are the simplest ones. And you reminded me of that." As she drifted off to sleep, her breathing slow and steady, Daniel stayed by her side for a while, watching her. She looked so small under the blanket, her face peaceful in the glow of the nightlight. Yet, despite her size, she had just changed the course of his entire company, without even knowing it. The next day at work, the CEO gathered the team once more. The client had approved the solution, and contracts were moving forward. The deal was saved. This, the CEO said, standing proudly at the head of the table, was a lesson for all of us. We were too busy chasing the complicated answer when the simple one was right in front of us. Let's never forget that. The engineers nodded in agreement. Some smiled sheepishly, others shook their heads, still amazed that they had missed it. But for Daniel, the words rang louder than they knew. That evening, as he walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't weighed down by worry or doubt. He thought about his journey as a single father, the sleepless nights, the endless responsibilities, the moments he feared he wasn't enough. But then he thought about Lily, and how she had proven, without even trying, that together they were more than enough. When he opened the door, Lily was waiting, as always. She threw herself into his arms, laughing as he lifted her off the ground. "Daddy, tell me everything. What happened today?" He spun her gently before setting her down. "Everything is better now, sweetheart. The whole company is moving forward again. And, you know what? You're the reason why." Her eyes sparkled. "Me?" "Yes," he said firmly. "You. You saw something no one else did. You reminded us all that sometimes the best answer is the simple one." She beamed, her little chest puffing out with pride. "Easy peasy," she said again, giggling. Daniel laughed with her, his heart swelling. Yes, easy peasy. That night, as he watched her fall asleep once more, Daniel whispered a promise to himself. He promised that no matter what life threw at them, he would always listen to her voice, always value her perspective, and always remind her of how extraordinary she truly was. Because while the CEO and the top engineers had been left speechless by a solution they couldn't see, Daniel knew the deeper truth. His daughter was a reminder that even in the hardest seasons of life, light can shine from the most unexpected places. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. What he needed was right there, asleep in the next room, a little girl who believed the world could be easy peasy, and who made him believe it too. And in that belief, Daniel realized, lay the greatest solution of all.